Hi, I'm Annie Bayeux, and I'm Degreed's Chief Learning Strategist. Welcome to today's episode of Degreed Dialogue, co-hosted by Fosway. I'd like to share with you today a panel discussion that I had with Fiona Letney, Senior Analyst from the Fosway Group, and my colleague Colin Pogue, who is a Senior Business Analyst, or how we like to call him internally, Mr. ROI. And that's really appropriate for today's topic of learning in a recession. So without further ado, here's our discussion.
So I'm super excited to chat with both of you today, especially about this topic, because I think that we probably all three have collectively heard hours and hours, maybe days, about the recession. Everybody, including the news and the media, is saying that this recession is looming. But more recently, we've heard analysts talk about maybe it might not be a recession. Maybe it might just be an economic downturn. But the result of it is the same. We're hearing in the news about market shifts and layoffs, the L word, right? We've heard a lot about layoffs, which makes us, even if a recession isn't coming, it makes companies brace or prepare for that. And we all know budget season is right now. And so we thought this was a great time to talk about it. But before we start and get into the meat of the topic, I want to set the stage a little bit. Are we really in it? What can we call that? Can I get both of you to kind of chime in about what is going on and what do you see is actually going to happen in 2023? Fiona, can I get to you first?
Yes, of course. So actually, Annie, I want to start with a positive. So from our digital realities research last year in learning, we found that actually there is a huge amount of investment going on in learning, and over 40% of the respondees from learning and development are saying that they are likely to increase their budgets in the coming year, and only 8% said that they were likely to decrease it. But that said, things can change almost overnight. So we should always be prepared for that potential downturn and what we need to do in that downturn. So yeah, we've got to keep an eye on the signs that are going on around the world.
And Annie, it occurs to me that, from an economist perspective, recessions are something that are usually defined in retrospect, after the fact, right? But the cycles that we all know exist in normal economic times, even booms, bust, whatever it might be, I think it's intelligent and maybe wise for us to always be prepared wherever we are on that roller coaster, right? Because we know, like you said earlier, an upturn is coming, but so is a downturn, and then yet again. So wherever we are on that roller coaster, we need to be prepared. So I think it's always great to take a step back and think a little bit about how we operate with respect to this ups and downs.
Yeah, those are great points. And I think that one of the great lessons coming from the pandemic is how do we prepare for the unknown, right?
Exactly.
And so I'm hoping that we get into that conversation today about that unknown. But so regardless of how we call it or how we label it today, whether or not in 1 year we're going to be calling it a recession that we just lived through, I think that I think that we can agree on one thing is now is a great time to either double down or maintain that learning budget. And it's a really horrible time to be cutting it. But the reality is that we do cut it, and it's cut a lot. Unfortunately, budget cuts are not very foreign to L&D. I have been in kind of the corporate world for 25 years before moving over to Degreed. And in those 25 years, I've been in various roles in L&D and HR technology. I can't think of a time where at one point of time in my tenure in those companies that we didn't have a cost-saving measures. And usually when we hear, okay, we need more cash flow, we're moving to make an acquisition, we had a bad revenue year, all really good reasons to do cost-cutting measures. Learning was always at the top of that list to go first. We had, let's cut down on travel, let's cut down on consultancies. and let's freeze those learning budgets and let's cancel all of those face-to-face courses because, of course, they're dependent on travel and consultancy in the most cases. And so I'm kind of used to that. And I feel like the people that are listening to this podcast, the L&D, they're probably somewhat familiar with it. But if you're not familiar with it, or that you're always a victim to this cost cutting, I want to talk a little bit about the words and the arguments that you can use when, like, the C-suite comes looking for that budget and knocks on your door. So what can we say? So with that, I do think that I'd like to start with the first question, um, with you, Fiona, around, okay, so what are the things that the business leaders in the C-suite, what are the things or the arguments that we can use, to help kind of make them realize that investment is important now and not later?
Yes, Annie. Well, as you mentioned, I go back quite a long way, over 20 years in terms of being in the business. And over that time, what comes to mind when we're talking about recession or economic downturns is that it used to be that it was the marketing budget and the training budgets that got cut. That's what I remember going back, quite a number of years. But marketing got their act together and they started to add data into what they did so that they could go to the C-suite and say, we've got a return on investment on that particular campaign. They knew what they were doing. So the problem has been is that training haven't really been able to prove, if you like, the return on investment. And so one of the things that I think is so important is that we do need to be able to measure that impact of learning so that we can take our arguments to the C-suite. What we're seeing in the surveys that we've been doing is that almost half of L&D are under pressure or even more pressure to actually show their value to the business. And less than half believe that their C-suites see L&D as being central to the success of the organization, which we need to change that. That's not good. And I think the thing is, during the pandemic, there was so much good going on in the L&D departments to maintain the organizations and to keep them afloat that they at that point in time probably had their feet under the table of the C-suite, but actually now perhaps that's waning a little bit. I think it also depends on maybe the size of the organization and it's whether the L&D departments are close to the business. It's easier when it's a smaller organization, but as organizations grow and grow, then the L&D departments can become a little bit more siloed. Maybe they're central, just looking after the compliance or leadership programs. And so the business, and they can end up, because of that, getting the budgets cut. And I've heard a number of things where actually in the business, let's say it was sales training, they are having their budgets increase because they are able to measure the impact of learning. The salespeople needing to know what are the USPs for this particular product and being able to sell well and share with their peers. So I think one of the things that, again, from a survey perspective, we're seeing that over half of the L&Ds are thinking about expanding their resources, their people resources, to those SMEs who can actually create the content and it be much more agile. We've heard reports from the business front line to say that L&D have not been agile because they've had their budgets cut, and so there's probably fewer people able to put things onto a learning system, for example. But actually, if you can increase or expand that resource into the business and be closer to the business, then I think that's a massive source of data to show the impact of learning on the business. Does that make sense?
It makes absolute sense. And it's funny that you say that because I think that when I was over on the corporate side, A lot of the struggle was trying to get a strategic seat at the table. And yet, I was very guilty of this, as well as probably a lot of my peers, is I'm still sitting there talking about completion rates, and they want me to be relevant, and I wanted to be in front of the business, but what kind of credibility does an L&D have when we're super focused on completion, which is really important. Don't get me wrong. It's important to keep business operating. It's important for compliance. However, when we're talking about business impact, we really see a hard time how we can correlate that together. Colin, what about you? One of the words, you're Mr. Data. What do you think?
Well, I think when you're making arguments of any kind and communicating to anyone, I always talk about, the simple tenet of understanding who your audience is and what it is they need. And so having a little bit of empathy here, thinking about who we're really trying to convince, who we're trying to persuade, and often it's budget owners, the C-suite, et cetera, senior managers, and we have to recognize how are they feeling when we talk about our metrics, right? What metrics do we need to say in order to really change how they think and feel and operate? We need to recognize they're under immense pressure themselves, right? And it's up to us to give them the arguments, the data, the metrics that they need to be convinced. We don't need to lay out some L&D metrics and assume that they'll appreciate what that means. For example, completions that you mentioned. Really important metric. Usually not a convincing one, though, for folks that aren't from cut from an L&D cloth. And so more success stories, thinking about deeper discussions with respect to data, and identifying and sharing the impact that it has on the business is really important. And I think underneath all of this is the mindset of our audience, right? We can first start by thinking about what mindset are we trying to adjust. And I feel like this point we made earlier, that downturns in many ways are the best time to invest in our people, because budgets are cut, because projects are slowed, because still cash is king. We need to be efficient, but also folks have more capacity than ever, right? And so that can be an ideal time to make sure we develop the skills that matter. And organizations that are strategic about downturns in general, remind me of Warren Buffett, right? And so he can often take great advantage of the opportunity that a downturn presents, whatever it looks like, whether it's your own making as an organization, right? Whether it's some cost-cutting internal effort versus external sort of pressures or recession. But Warren Buffett says you can get little insights into his mindset based on some quotes and some approaches that he's had, which I think are fascinating. So he leverages downturn to get ahead. He famously said, bad news is your best friend, right? Because it creates opportunity. And so we don't need to run from bad news. We need to look for how we can make sure to leverage that in a way that's healthy for what we're responsible to do. He also said the best investment by far is anything that develops yourself, partially because it's not taxed, right? We're not valued in the same way that an asset is, and depreciation and taxes, et cetera, aren't applied to how many skills we have per se directly. And so then he also said that recessions won't last forever. And so very particularly, you're planning, again, as we've mentioned, for how to recover. So don't think about how to survive the downturn, rather think about it as an opportunity, and think about it as a way that this economic uncertainty can actually lead us to greater success into the future. And so that'll set us up to succeed. It's more of a springboard, right, than just a pit we can wallow in, but think about a way to use that downturn as a springboard instead of delaying the benefit that you would sort of reap once you start trying to recover at the return of quote unquote normal.
I really love that quote around Warren Buffett. And I'm wondering if he doesn't speak Chinese, because the Chinese symbol for crisis and the Chinese symbol for opportunity are actually the same symbol. So that's interesting, the way we're looking at that kind of crisis turned into opportunity. I don't think he's very Buddhist, though. I'm not sure. Let's go on to the next topic. So that was really interesting. And I think that, it's a lot of L&D are probably sitting here thinking, okay, yeah, right, no brainer, talk about business value. But we've been trying to kind of find what those learning metrics are. For years, we've been trying to make a link between the programs that we launch and the actual kind of Kirkpatrick level value. that it could provide, and obviously business impact is at the top of that pyramid. And so it's easy for us to sit there and say, well, talk with value. But what do we actually mean? I'd really like to dive into this part right now, because when we're thinking about, when I think about, the first things that even my manager in HR would come in and tell me, it's like, okay, um, get rid of our leadership programs. We don't need leadership in those times. No, they're probably half of my budget or half of any L&D budget. So it's probably a very easy target. But without even going there, the topics around values, happiness, culture, those seem to be those kind of fluffy topics that people want to attack first. People who don't know about L&D or don't know about development want to attack first. And so I think the bigger question is, so we're sitting here in front of the CFO, the CEO, whoever is kind of controlling that budget at the C-suite, and we want to talk about that value. Maybe we don't have all the metrics that we need today. Maybe we want to kind of show in some research that might not be relevant in the exact same, or maybe not relevant, but might not be applicable in your organization. But what can we kind of think about when we're talking about people investment? Why people investment and not other types of investments or CapEx investments that they can do to actually help improve the life of the employee too? Why people investment? Fiona, can I ask you to go again first?
Yeah, so I think people, that's where the magic happens. I remember back, and again, we're talking about 20 years ago, to when I did my MBA, and there was an economic model, and the cognitive wave or cycle that's talked about, and it talks about, and we've already sort of mentioned some of this, is there's a downturn, but then there'll be an upturn, and it's in those recession or depression times where there needs to be the creativity, and it resonated with me back then, even to the point where even if you're an individual and you've just lost your job, the creativity is almost forced on you. You've got to come up with something. You've got to either, can I set up my own business? What can I do with the skills that I've got? And so there's that creativity in that downturn that can set you up for what's coming next, which will be an upturn. And but it's easier, or more essential then, should I say, rather than when you're riding the crest of the wave in a boom time. And so I think investing in people at that moment in time, and it could be developing or inspiring those that can come up with the new ideas, new products that can be taken to market. And also an extension of that is then upskilling, reskilling those people that are going to be doing the selling, going to be doing, delivering the service or whatever. And so at that time, it's a great time to be investing, developing, inspiring your people to move and be ready for the next phase.
Yeah, I love that. I mean, I always think it's a great time, being with my L&D hat on, I always think it's a great time to invest in people. I think another, just listening to you speak, unfortunately, a lot of people, during economic cost saving measures within a company, there's a lot of projects that are being canceled, right? People aren't traveling for internal meetings, or less busy, unfortunately, less busy, especially support functions. So I thought it was always a really great opportunity to say, hey, we've got people that are free here. They've all of a sudden got this kind of freed up bandwidth because they're not doing this or that. The company is choosing their priorities and choosing to focus. And so when it's not coupled with something like a reduction in force, where they're actually losing team members and they have to kind of double up for that lost productivity. When it's not coupled with that, when we're just doing cost savings, I think it's a great opportunity for kind of those freed minds or that kind of changed mindset that Colin was talking about. Colin, what about you? What would you say? What are the numbers that you would give to people, or what are the kind of metrics
Yeah.
that we can investigate?
I think we always have to remember to be fighting to measure the right things. As we talked about before, there are lots of different metrics out there, and we have to think about our audience, think about what it is they need, and think about what point we're making. And so making sure in our case where we're connecting learning and development to the business value it creates. So what comes to mind here is that we've recently created a deep dive bit of analysis with a client to do this very thing. And I'll just quickly summarize some of the interesting results that we found around the transformational business-oriented impact of the program. Now, of course, there was a lot of really cool L&D metrics associated with that I won't highlight here, but some of the core business ones related to making sure that or that we could connect the dots between attrition and the program, right? So we saw that proactive degreed users were drastically less likely to attrit, several percentage points. And in an organization, when you're talking about that many people, it's an insanely valuable stat in the millions, the dozens of millions of dollars of impact for the business. Also, proactive degreed users we saw performed 14% higher on their performance reviews. And so they became known as, stronger performers in the organization, which was really, really impressive to see. We thirdly saw that the group was much more significantly engaged as per their Gallup surveys, and that, organizations care about engagement for lots of reasons, obviously, for productivity, for some of the turnover, satisfaction, for hiring, and so forth. And so it's valuable across multiple dimensions of the business. And often that's a particular thing that the C-suite has established as a target goal, right? An initiative they're really trying to improve around the culture, around satisfaction, and so forth. And the fourth one also related to kind of satisfaction, but it was related to leaders being satisfied in their roles, leaders being satisfied in how they were being promoted, and their mobility opportunities, their retention opportunities. So if you looked at the subset of folks that used Degree that participated in a leadership program, they were leaders, they were also wildly successful. And noting that this company reduced external spend as well by 37% over 2 years. And so just a quick run through of some of these findings, but they're really powerful, right? As soon as we start talking about metrics that matter to the business, then we're enabling business success, right? We know down deep that L&D has done that all along, enabled business success, and been critical for that. The thing I think we need to do now is connect the dots, make it an easier conversion from what we know L&D does well at the core to how it's measured and how it's discussed. And you could even argue that how would you know that these points aren't just around people who are already strong performers, right? Like which came first, the strong performer or the strong performers are using Degree, right? And I think that that's probably a fair challenge. The truth, I believe, is somewhere in between, that in some cases the program really created strong performers, and in other cases it's the place strong performers go to develop themselves, and they use the platform widely. But either way, I think is a valuable way to frame up the approach to say, in some cases we create strong performers, in other cases we're supporting strong performers. So maybe we all need to engage here more deeply. And so it helps us create buy-in when you're really thinking about it, in a way that affects the business. I think also the right investments can help you just fundamentally in the short run, right? Help you establish that Degree can help you do more with less, right? Being tactical, being strategic. We've had other studies with external partners and internal partners that highlight that there's a 6-month payback period often for Degree, right? And we can connect to the values of upskilling, the values of cost takeout even in L&D in an efficient way, saving some budget, some onboarding savings relating to retention, as I mentioned earlier. And so multiple other facets of evidence that you can start to really tightly weave together this argument that L&D matters to the business, not just because it's something that we all sort of have to do or all generally want to do, but it actually enables real business priorities. And it's low risk, right? These low risk investments are critical to prioritize, especially and even when times are tight and dollars are tight. And so doing more with less, making sure you're reducing waste, increasing productivity, and knowing that these times of recession are times that those things matter. And then the third thing I'll mention quickly is long-term benefits, right? So it's like a farmer planting seeds today to sow into the future. You're planning for this, as we mentioned before. And so individuals can be destabilized and demoralized during what feels like a downturn that everybody keeps talking about. And so it's very, it demonstrates confidence, it demonstrates belief in the organization when leaders are visibly investing in their people. And that can have a great impact just on the belief and the feelings in the organization. And so the instinct to pause is natural, I think, and there's a lot of pressures. We need to frame up our arguments right. We need to use our data well and make sure that we're not ignoring the fact that it is a great time and there are some ways we can serve our people well during this time, especially these uncertain times. As I mentioned earlier, Warren Buffett, when people talk about downturns and they're pausing, they're shrinking, he starts to look for opportunity.
I love that. And I think both of you are 100% correct. And when I mentioned a little earlier about those kind of fluffy topics that L&D has, I don't think of them as fluffy topics, but I do know the business does think about them in fluffy topics. You touched on leadership, you touched on happiness. Those are really considered nice to have, because L&D doesn't understand how to, or some L&D don't understand how to frame them up as you did as must-haves. How, we have this kind of idea that we shouldn't deal with culture because that's fluffy. It doesn't have a direct link to business. But when you make that additional step to attrition or retention, or the productivity of your employees, because it's linked to their happiness, I think that that's a better way to frame it up. And I think in a lot of ways, L&D, we're kind of the poor, misunderstood of kind of the HR family. And I think mainly is our responsibility as like L&D leaders, is to find those words, find the arguments to show the value in what we're doing. And I would say, it's funny because a lot of people that I'm talking to right now saying, well, I don't really want to talk about culture because that's not considered something that is a priority. But when I think about what you said, Fiona, at the very beginning, when we're talking about building that capable workforce and preparing for the upturn, the best way to do that is create that agility and resilience, right? We know that from the pandemic. Yeah, yeah. And so when we're thinking about, that should be our priority, and anything around building an agile and resilient organization is something we definitely should do so we can actually even bounce back faster. Fiona, before we moved on to the next topic, would you like to have some closing words on this idea of, having these elements or words to talk to the C-suite about people investment?
So yes, it is just so important. We know that there is so much that as we've just spoken about, that the people are the lifeblood of any organization, and therefore they need to be invested in at whatever stage they're at in their their journey within an organization. And so I think there is also there's times when, and I think we'll probably come on to this, but there's times when it's necessary to reskill some of those. So there is either technology or products that have been sunsetted or whatever, and it's important to invest in those people that you have to take them on to the next step, rather than necessarily recruit new, because we know that sort of in the marketplace it's difficult to recruit these days because there is there are there's a war on the talent, to be honest, in any situation that you can be in. And so upskilling, reskilling your existing employees, your existing people, is going to be quicker and easier, and you'll get more of a return on that investment than going out to recruit. I think so. I think that that's another reason for making sure that you're investing in your own people.
I'm glad you said the words of war on talent because I think I've been talking about it for the last 4 or 5 years when we talk about future of work, war on talent, and all of a sudden, and we're saying, especially that's going to hit the tech industry, and then now we have all the announcements of layoffs. So. Is there really going to be a talent shortage this year? Or what's the market? What is your data telling you the market's going to look like for that?
So a little bit of anecdotal sort of answer to that. So last year we were hearing from some of the smaller vendors in the learning system space that they were losing some of their developer talent to what they were terming the kind of the destination vendors, so the larger vendors, and were struggling then with their roadmaps, were struggling to be able to deliver the innovation to their customers that they were wanting to do. And so now that there is maybe some of the larger organizations are wanting to be able to cut back on some of their staff, then it might come back downstream. And because there is still growth in some of particularly the smaller companies, those companies that can service and support the smaller, less mature organizations that are just starting to get onto um, the digital learning train journey, if you like, and so I mean, one of the things that we do say in this year's 9 Grid report about the war on talent is that the fact that there is potentially a dearth of the developers, because it's dependent on where in that organization, but developer talent is actually the area that there's probably an issue. And if we haven't got enough, and if you look at the 9 Grid, there particularly mid-market, it's just there are masses of organizations. We ended up having to take off quite a number of existing organizations to bring some of the new ones on, and even then there were a lot that have been left in the wings. And so there are a lot of organizations all wanting to deliver the same thing. Does that mean that we're actually stopping the innovation to happen much more quickly, accelerate that? If we came together, if there were more acquisitions, maybe we might see that in the future. But yeah, so I think there is, I think there's still definitely, from particularly the developer side, there is a need for more of that in the market, whichever way you look at it.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the CLOs and CHROs that I'm talking to actually feel it, and they say, I understand there's a lot of layoffs, but the scarcity of talents, and this is the thing, is we talk about layoffs, but we don't talk about the skill sets that are linked to that layoffs. And what a lot of CHROs are saying is, yeah, there's a lot more people on the market, but they don't have the scarce skill sets that I actually need. So there's still a mini war on talent based on these specific skills. But what's kind of saturating the market is more the common skills. They're more versatile and they can stretch across a lot of even mid-market or enterprise types of companies that are larger, those global 2000s, but they don't have that skill set that we're looking for. So I guess that's some good news for L&D because we can start to grow them. This is going to be my next topic. So just moving on to our last and final topic around managing through an economic downturn is once that we've decided that we are going to, that we've had the good fight, we've had the good discussions with our C-suite, we've managed to protect our budgets. They agree that L&D should get a big part of that HR budget cake, right? And so when we're looking at it, we're saying, okay, now we want to talk about people investments, and we've been talking about that. But I want to be really specific and help guide our listeners today around what do we think is actually the best investment to make? What do we actually mean when we say we need to invest in people? So, Fiona, I've had you gone first a few times. I want to kick it first over to Colin to get his opinion on where should we be doing that kind of people investment.
Yeah, it's a great question, and I mean, my mind just immediately goes to something that, obviously, in the context of this current discussion, the challenge is we have to do it in terms of what the business cares about, what the business prioritizes. So we've mentioned skills earlier, right? So I think understanding and investing in the actual capabilities and skills that an organization needs. And these are always a combination of things, or usually a combination of things, in my opinion, from the people themselves, from the process through which they learn, through the technology they're using to learn and develop, and understand that, to measure that, to gain insights from that. But whatever we do, we need to just, again, understand our stakeholders and know that we need to position this in a way that helps them win in their job, helps them do their job better, helps them accomplish and prioritize their own goals better. So I guess at the end of the day, it's probably a little bit of a cop-out answer to say all of the above, right? But I think we need to think about it systematically and think about it from a data-driven perspective so that our audiences have a way to appreciate what it is that we're actually doing for them, not just for ourselves, right? And when I say ourselves, I mean our function versus their function. And so I think positioning is really important, and understanding that a cohesive and professional argument to say, look, it's going to be actual literally investing in individual people for these purposes. It's going to be building technologies and platforms for these purposes, and all of this will come together for your purposes, right? It will help you in your job, Mr. Stakeholder, Mrs. Stakeholder. So I think a lot of it is understanding it all comes together that way and framing it in a way that benefits them.
Mhm. Yeah, that's a great point.
And what we're seeing is that it's nearly 80% of L&D are seeing that building skills is increasingly of a high priority to show for a successful business. So everybody, I mean, this is the good news. Everybody is talking about skills. Skills is the fuel. Skills is you know is what's being talked about, but different parts of the organization, they're trying to get their arms around this. But where L&D can step up is that it's in L&D that the reskilling and the upskilling happens. And therefore, it might be in maybe an HR system or whatever, where the data is being held, the skills engines, etc. But actually, where the upskilling and reskilling happens in L&D. And I think the learning systems have got to play ball with this as well. And it's important that the data is being passed into the right places to actually show that upskilling and reskilling has actually happened. So I think it's that's where L&D can be talking the business language, if you like, because everybody is talking about skills, and that there is a skills gap in certain areas. And so that's, I think, a great focus to be able to take to the C-suite. Yeah, we can deliver this. And so it's a strategic play really for L&D in this case.
Absolutely. And you both have really focused on skilling and upskilling, and I fully agree. I guess that we don't have anybody on here to argue the counterpoint. Probably natural selection, right, of the experts that we have on today. But yeah, I think that skilling, it's funny, like maybe a year and a half ago, and I've been talking to clients probably about 4 or 5 years about LXP now. And, a lot of them come to me and say, well, you know what? I really loved your skills story and what you guys have, but our organization, we're just not ready for it this year. And I say, yeah, that's fine. And they go on to buy our LXP and they say, well, when we're ready, we'll kind of go and unlock the kind of skills part of that, whatever that means. But they're ready. They're not ready to focus on the skills data. They're ready to focus on skills and upskilling, actually, giving programs. And so when I'm looking at this, I've actually started going back and talking to those same people saying, you know what, even if you think that your organization's not ready to talk skills, in fact, this year for me is the perfect year to be talking about that. This is the year that we can start collecting skills data, right? Understanding what skills we have in our organization. So when that upturn kicks in and we actually start to get busier, we're making more revenue, things in the economy are looking better. What's happening is if we've done it this year, we start to have that skills data and we know how we can be agile, how we can move in different directions, and we know the skills that we have today. And unfortunately, and I'm not suggesting this, please don't turn my words around, but that same skills data can tell you about the scarcity or the abundance of skills to help you in things, God forbid, if it gets worse and you have to do another reduction in force, or things get better and we know now we can start opening up hiring. We've had a hiring freeze for the last year. Now that we start doing the hiring, we have a really good understanding of the missing skills that we need and what we need to focus on. Even being able to focus on whether or not we have the potential to develop skills and grow skills, something that I'm a big fan of, or if we have to resort to buying skills, right? So I do think that those are really good suggestions that you guys both have. I'd like to add in just one other suggestion. You guys tell me what you think. Is that I really feel like now we can bring culture back into the discussion, because when we're thinking about resiliency, when we're thinking about agility, I automatically associate that in my head with a positive learning culture. You become agile with the skills, you become agile because you can upskill, reskill, deep skill. A lot of people will have different definitions of that, but generally, to learn a little, learn wide, or learn a lot is how I would say that, or learn again. Um, those are the important factors when you're thinking about what drives that kind of agility within an organization. One of our clients during the pandemic sold alcoholic beverages, spirits, and quickly had to reskill because they decided 2 or 3 months in that they were going to actually not sell, but produce hand sanitizer, because that was really much in need. And they needed to reskill a lot of people in a very short time for a very important mission. And that kind of reminds me, I think it's a really great story to think about how they kind of reconverted their spirits factory into a hand sanitizer factory within just a few months. I think it took them 2 to 3 months and 2 months in people training. And when you're looking at that, number one, you see the real business impact, but then you see the value in that upskilling during that period, when activity arguably was really, really low. People, I don't know about you guys, but the first few months I was really bored at work because we had nothing to do, because there was so much in limbo. So I do think that is an important part of it. And to drive that agility, positive learning culture, to me, we can work on culture, we can invest in, anchoring in a ritual of everyday learning. We can anchor in the ritual of social learning or learning off of others. We can double down, do some shadowing, and deep skill people. I think this is a perfect time to do deep transformation within your organization. not because you're doing well, but because you're doing badly. And that, that kind of deep transformation helps to kind of reboost and renew who you are as a company. So it's always a really good time for me. So that would be kind of my answers around where we would need to kind of pivot our people investment to. Um, I've talked a lot. What do you guys think of that? Are there any other things that you would add to that list of, come on, if you're going to invest in your people, buy this or invest in this area?
To answer that, Annie, the only thing that comes to mind for me is that learning culture obviously is critical for healthy organizations, but I think a lot of it is sequencing, right? In terms of goals and how we communicate that. If learning culture is the stated goal from the beginning, in some ways you might lose your audience, right? At least the broader senior audience. I think it's an awesome and important outcome, an awesome important goal for L&D minded folks, but we also have to think about how we get there and make that more tangible and make that connected to business initiatives, business goals, business metrics. And then knowing that if we structure that right, we can have our cake and eat it too here. We can actually help the business and get a learning culture in the end. But if you set out to get a learning culture, in some ways you get neither.
Yeah, that's a great point, Colin. And like I said, we've got to be careful with the C word around the C-suite, right? And word is culture. And I think that we have a lot to advance on. So there's just so much to dig into, but we only have so much time. And so with that, I think this concludes today's episode of Degree Dialogue. I really want to thank Fiona and Colin for your insights and expertise on this really important topic. We hope that this discussion has given you some food for thought and armed you with at least some ideas on moving forward. We'd love to hear about what you think. We've said a lot of controversial or not so controversial things during the episode. So please do leave comments for us. We will be reading them. And if you want some of our feedback, you can reach out to any of us on LinkedIn. We'll be happy to engage with you there. And if you found this discussion helpful, be sure also to share it with your colleagues and friends. This is Annie Bayeux signing off for now.